Hi, welcome back to Philosophy of Religion with this week's lecture. Let's take an account of where we are and how we got here. We started the semester by talking about different models for how the relationship between philosophy and religious belief would work. Remember, we had 4 views on that idea. We had positivism, we had Wittgensteinianism, we had views like Clifford, and we had views like Aquinas's. Then we talked about different concepts of God. Remember, there were 2 big ones there, theistic personalism and classical theism. After that, we looked at arguments for God's existence, as well as possible flaws in those arguments. Then last time I talked to you a little bit about divine simplicity, and I tried to impress upon you that divine simplicity is the key to a whole big thing called apophatic theology, right? Negative theology, a kind of theology where we talk about what God is not. Divine simplicity is the key on which everything in classical theism is going to hinge. I mean, reject divine simplicity and you're going to go down one road theologically. Accept divine simplicity and you're going to find yourself on quite a different one. So now we're at one of those interesting places in a course where there's so many different directions I could take you. I could opt to talk about some of the traditional divine attributes. You know, things like the claim that God is all-knowing or that God is all-powerful. Or we could look at some traditional religious claims about miracles or life after death, or even the relationship between morality and belief in God. Or we could look at whether everything we've been doing has been a waste of time, because, after all, isn't there some really good evidence God doesn't exist? Like famine and war, coronavirus, hatred, racism, poverty, suffering, cancer, you name it. Well, all those things are very interesting, and I do think we'll have time to talk about at least some of them before our online semester is over. But this week I was thinking maybe I'll keep hammering away at some of this apophatic stuff. Last week I came at it from the angle of divine simplicity, the claim that God has no parts, no this and that, certainly no physical parts, but also no distinction between divinity and any feature that you ascribe to God. This week I'm going to examine the idea that God also lacks temporal parts. And that's why this week's lecture is entitled Divine Eternity. I think I'd like to distinguish between 2 kinds of eternity, 2 ways that people sometimes use the word eternal. We'll call the first basic eternality. I'll give you a fancier word for it in a moment, but let's think about it just for now in terms of, I call it basic eternity. Some people, and this is a claim very popular amongst theistic personalists, people who are quite insistent that God is some sort of cosmic person, some people are quite insistent that all we mean when we say God is eternal is that God's always been there. That God has no beginning, no end. That if you point to any moment in history, you could say, yes, even then God existed. Unlike, say, me. You go back enough years, and there's no me there to be talked about. You go forward enough years, there'll be no me to be talked about. But the claim is that did God exist in 1729? Yes. 3000 BC? Yes. 1.5 million years ago? Of course. That's basic eternality. And here's a fancy word that philosophers use for that. Sempiternality. S-E-M-P-I-T-E-R-N-A-L-I-T-Y. Sempiternality. Sempiternality. Right. It's basically combining the words semi with eternal. Sempiternal. We just snick a P in there. You say semi-eternal 10 times fast and you'll get sempiternal. Maybe. Okay, so that's theistic personalism on the issue of God and time. It's very basic. God's always been there. Get ready. Things are about to get exciting right now when I tell you about classical theism and the issue of God's relationship to time. Do you recall one of the ways that a classical theist thinks about God is as something that cannot change? God can't change, you see, because there's when you look at what change is, change always involves something remaining the same in one way and becoming different in another. That's what change is. You change from being a junior in college to a senior when you're still the same person, right? You still have the same DNA. Many things are still the same about you this year as were true last year. But something has changed, namely your progress in college. If you decide to take up a fitness program, an exercise program, well, you'll change with regards to your physical health, but maybe you'll still be a very generous person, right? Your generosity hasn't changed. Change always involves staying the same in one way, but being altered in another. But God doesn't have this and that. There are no parts in God, no aspects, no distinct aspects in God by which God can remain in one way the same and in another different. It's just not applicable to God on the classical theist's account. Caffeine. Gotta stay caffeinated in these crazy days of coronavirus. So, given that there's no this and that in God, how can God change? Okay, God can't. We've already gone through that. You may recall it. Review past lectures. But now let's think about what time is. Time seems to just be a measure of change. Think about the concepts of before, during, and after. Before, during, and after. Think about those concepts. Get ready. Before, during, and after what? Before what? During what? After what? Are you starting to see the connection? Okay, no you're not, you say. Spell it out for me, Kovac. I'll spell it out. I'll break it down. The whole concept of before, during, and after. That is to say, the whole concept of time just is intrinsically bound up with the notion of change. We only have the concepts before, during, and after because they depend on a prior notion of change. Before you were a senior. Oh, before you were a senior? You mean you became a senior? You changed into a senior? Ah. What's during? During just means without some change. During my senior year. During your senior year? What happened during your senior year? Anything you talk about that was during your senior year will involve something that happened at the point where you first changed into a senior, and then all the moments on the timeline where you did not change away from being a senior. If you're talking about something that didn't happen during your senior year, it's either before you changed into a senior or after you changed out of not being a senior. Before, during, and after, which is that just exhausts our temporal concepts. Before, during, and after. That whole notion of time only makes sense when you're talking about things subject to change. Ah, but God isn't subject to change. Now what? Now we're getting into an idea of eternality, which is more than just always around. Always around doesn't begin to touch the divine essence for the classical theist. No. Sure, it was true that in 1761 anybody who said God exists was uttering a true statement, according to the classical theist. But that doesn't go nearly far enough, because the whole concept of time, which is bound up with a concept of change, and God being not subject to change, means, get ready, for the classical theist, God isn't subject to time. God does not have a temporal existence, according to the classical theist. You and I have temporal existences. There's all these befores and afters and durings in my life. Everything you can think of has a temporal existence, I think. I'm not sure I can think of things that don't have temporal existences. Can you? Can you? Oh, you clever boys and girls, can you? Are you clever enough to think of something without a temporal existence? You know what some philosophers say doesn't have a temporal existence? Numbers. We won't get into that debate. How will we avoid that debate? Here's how we will avoid that debate. We will avoid that debate because I will now give you the traditional classical theist definition of divine eternity. Here's what it really means to say something is eternal, according to... Oh, and you're asking me, well, who came up with this definition, huh? There was a cool guy named Boethius. Boethius, you can drop that name at a party. Oh, as Boethius wrote in the Consolations of Philosophy, you know, he died about 530 AD. That's a nice pedantic thing you can say at a cocktail party, and everyone's like, oh, she's quoting Boethius, let's get her another gin and tonic. Boethius, this guy who died in like 530 AD, he defined divine eternality as follows. Having complete, simultaneous possession of life, complete simultaneous possession of interminable life all at once. Let's break it down. Life. We'll start with that one. Is the number 7 a living thing? I don't think so. No definition I know of living thing can include the number 7. And you say, well, what about 8? No, can't get none of the numbers, okay? Any number you think of, none of them are alive. But God has life in some sense, right? God acts. God has a causal activity that's not coerced by anything else. So sure, God is alive. Not a biological life. No beating heart. No blood in the veins. No reproduction and nourishment. That's biological life. That's biological life. God has life in some other sense. God has life in the sense that God acts without having to be coerced. That looks like life to me. And you say, well, I thought life was just biological life. Why would you think that? Because somebody told you to think that? You can think better than that. That's what happens in philosophy. Philosophy, you start to learn to think outside the confines that other teachers have given you. You start to see that the barriers of other teachers break down in philosophy. Okay, so God has life, but the claim here, going all the way back to Boethius, championed by people like Aquinas, is that God's life, interminable. What's that mean? No beginning, no end. So far, not controversial. So far, that even the theistic personalist gets on board with what I've said on those 2 points. But now let's think it's complete and simultaneous. Complete and simultaneous. What does it mean? Do I have a complete life simultaneously? I have a complete life only after I've died. My life is complete only when I've died. Well, God doesn't die, so God has complete life, but also, I don't have life simultaneously. I have to go through time, moment to moment to moment, in a world full of changes, a world full of befores and afters, of pasts and futures. I have a future. God does not. I have a past. God does not. That's the claim. That's the claim. There are no events in the life of God, so to speak, for the classical theist. God's relationship to the temporal order, our order, is complete all at once. One instant, everything is right there for God. And to see why, you have to think about divine simplicity. You have to think about divine changelessness, what it means to say God is the source of change. So, complete simultaneous possession of life all at once. Complete simultaneous possession of a complete life, of a total life. That's what divine eternality is. It's different from sempiternality. Now, why are some people still theistic personalists? You know, everything's going to come down in philosophy of religion. I really think, I'm starting to think this more and more. In philosophy of religion, everything's going to come down with how comfortable you are with mystery, with divine mystery, with divine mysteriousness. You see, I know theistic personalists. I know people who, from the time they wake up to the time they go to sleep, their mantra is, God is a person. A bodiless person, a very powerful person, but nevertheless, just like I'm a person, that's what God is. And they tell me, they say, Kovac, complete possession of an interminable life all at once, I can't imagine what that's like. That's what they say to me. And my response has to be something like, boo-hoo! I don't know what God is. Oh my God, you expected to know? You expected to understand what it's like to be the answer to the question, why anything at all instead of nothing whatsoever? Give me a break! Well, it seems to come down to these conflicting intuitions. They really do expect that if they're going to believe in divine eternality, they should be able to understand, imagine what it's like to be eternal. See, they can imagine what it's like to always be around, right? I can at least imagine that. You can too. Go ahead and try. You're saying, oh, can I? Sure you can. Just imagine that instead of being born in whatever year you were born in, you go back, you were still there. You can imagine yourself living in the world where the dinosaurs lived in, can't you? Can't you? I bet you can. I bet you can. And now imagine being immortal. Imagine never going to be dead. You can imagine that, right? Well, they say, look, God's a person just like me. It's just, like that. There with the dinosaurs, there after global warming, coronavirus kills all of us, right? They say that's what God is. They can imagine that, so that's why they get on board with it. They can't imagine complete simultaneous possession of an interminable life. They can't imagine that, so they say it must be false. But in the classical theism tradition, where you have people like Aquinas, that's just... Here's the thing, I can't imagine it, but I can grasp it, at least partly. I can grasp life. I can grasp complete life. I've seen people lead complete lives. I can grasp complete possession of life. I can't imagine it. I can't imagine what it's like. But I can put the pieces together in a way where it's like, here's what I can't understand. I can neither imagine nor understand a triangle with 5 sides. No way. Not possible. Right? If you're talking to me about a 5-sided figure, you're talking about a pentagon. I say, talk to me about triangles, and you say, I'm going to tell you about a very special triangle. I say, okay. Is it isosceles? Equilateral? I'm ready. And you say, one of these very rarely seen 5-sided triangles. I'm going to say, no, false, right? See, I don't think that's what's going on when I talk about complete possession of an interminable life. I don't think that's what's going on. Because I can understand all the pieces, and I don't see any contradictions. I don't see a contradiction. There's a contradiction in saying, I know a triangle with 5 sides. I say, oh, tell me what you mean by triangle. And you say, oh, 3-sided figure. I say, oh, you know a 3-sided figure with 5 sides? No, you don't. You just contradicted yourself. But when I talk about divine eternality, nothing I'm saying is contradicting myself. I am going someplace I can't imagine. I can't picture it. But is that such a big deal? Is that such a big deal? Maybe you think it is. Maybe you think that it is. Maybe you'll give me some reasons down there in the comm box to tell me you think it's a big deal. But, me, not so convinced. Okay. Well, I think that's enough for us to chew on here about this eternality stuff. If you have questions, I'll have office hours later this week. I'll have, you can put stuff in the comm box. I'm trying to respond to as many comments as I can. I hope you're doing well. If you're having any troubles with this class or anything at LMU, send me an email. You know, this, as long as you're not taking this class as a major, you have the option of going pass-fail this semester. We call it credit, no credit. I think that would probably be a good idea for lots of people to consider that. Hang in there, and looking forward to seeing you all again someday.